Good morning. It's a great pleasure to welcome you at the 16th Annual Conference of Columbia's Center on Capitalism and Society. The Center, now beginning its 18th year, has taken up a succession of issues over these years, from innovation and growth to individualism and the good life. I want to add that our journal, Capitalism and Society, has been recast and is now being launched. Of course, I'm delighted by all this, even though we have more mountains to climb. This conference addresses the economic consequences of Mr. Trump, the theories that have led to these initiatives, and the moral that may have been used in an attempt to justify those initiatives. Although he may not remain president much longer, the legacy of policies will be scrutinized and evaluated for some years to come. In a way, this conference is the start of that serious evaluation. Trump's ideas and actions are not exogenous, of course. He came to power by exploiting the nation's anxiety over decade after decade of stagnant wages and generally low returns on assets, forced by slow productivity growth, the anger over immigration and the outsourcing of work, and the resentment of experts and elites whose interests lay elsewhere. This has led Trump to embrace a populism, the call for protection of jobs and identity of people with a distinct culture, to embrace populism and nativism, the call for protection of the interests of native-born or established inhabitants against the interests of immigrants. While one may see some of the steps as excessive, even ugly, we economists here may view these programs as an outgrowth of the idea of social protection originating in post-war Europe, and we may fear that they will be added impediments to indigenous innovation. Too much protection. As the anonymous op-ed put it of a couple of weeks ago, the president shows little affinity for free minds, free markets, and free people. Trump's call to make America great again, often referring to aggregates and averages, such as the nation's labor force participation rate, labor compensation per worker, overseas markets, and terms of trade, he is adopting the economic methods of corporatism. A corporatist state thinks nothing of demanding an individual or firm to make a sacrifice for the general interest. As I see it, Trump in this regard is much like Italy's Benito Mussolini or perhaps Hungary's Viktor Orban. Trump's inaugural address conveyed corporatism's doctrine of putting the right of the government to seek whatever goals it may decide on, or put those above the right of individuals to pursue their opportunities. Trump does not hesitate to attack firms such as Google and Amazon as not in the national interest, as he sees it. So there's much to discuss here. Ought we to credit the boom in jobs mostly to the bracing expectations of a pro-business climate, particularly cuts in corporate tax rates created by Trump? Ought we to blame the continuation of stagnant real wages on Trump's meddling with price setting and market forces? Ought we to blame the zero growth to which total factor productivity has fallen in large part? Blame that on the result of such meddling and the creation of huge uncertainty in the business sector? Ought we to blame some of the reported decline in health on Trump's cutbacks of health benefits? Ought we to blame Trump for failing to pick up life satisfaction from the low levels to which it has fallen in recent decades? Or is there evidence that life satisfaction has in fact picked up since Trump's election nearly 2 years ago. In my view, it has become, over the long era of weakened dynamism bringing slow growth and low life satisfaction, it has become a new responsibility on the shoulders of the nation's president to take reasonable measures to regain the prospering and the flourishing, the true greatness of our storied past. Has Trump taken any steps toward that goal? These questions, and no doubt others, are food for thought. And now, let's begin the first session.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? It's on?
See, these on? Yeah, we're on.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this conference. I'm honored to be here and speak in front of such an esteemed audience. Thank you particularly to Professor Phelps for providing such an important platform. I'll just say a few introductory words. If the system is rigged, then possibly nowhere more so than in the area of competition. Competition had already been skewed long before Trump, particularly by way of ever-increasing inequality, but Trump has taken this distortion to a whole new level. He's disrupted the system all right, especially by picking winners and losers. Examples include attacking companies by tweet like Amazon, causing them to lose billions of dollars in value overnight, calling for boycotts of companies like Apple, protecting industries like coal, instituting tariffs, arbitrarily granting exceptions, and offering subsidies to those affected, introduce tax cuts that almost exclusively benefit the top 15%, especially the financial industry, attacking media outlets, interfering in merger talks of conglomerates, not divesting himself of his conflicts of interest, and that also applies to his family and administration. I could give examples for that, but that would take the whole rest of the day. All this without any process, and while our institutions are under attack and under assault by our president. In addition to Trumponomics, there are other systemic misalignments like financialization, big tech, and other monopolies, which grow ever more powerful by way of network effects. Thankfully, we have a panel of renowned experts here today who are authorities on the subject and will enlighten us with their insights. Let me start with Rana Foroohar. She's a global business columnist and editor at the Financial Times. She frequently appears on CNN, where she's a global economic analyst. Previously, she worked as an editor, columnist, and award-winning correspondent at Times and Newsweek. Her highly acclaimed bestseller, Makers and Takers, about the financialization of the economy, was shortlisted for the Financial Times Book Award. Glenn Hubbard is professor of finance and economics at Columbia Business School. He's also a prolific author of countless scholarly articles, books, and commentaries. In the early 2000s, he was chairman of the U.S. Council of Economic Advisors. Currently, he's, among many other things, also co-chair of the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation. Matthew Bishop, whose name is still in the program, unfortunately had to excuse himself, but we deem ourselves lucky to have Charles Calomiris attend today as a discussant to fill in. Charles Calomiris is professor of financial institutions at Columbia Business School, a professor at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs, and a member of the Center on Capitalism and Society. His latest book, Fragile by Design, received the American Publishers Award and was named one of the best economics books by the Financial Times, The Times, and Bloomberg Businessweek. Thank you very much. Rana, I hand it off to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Sandra. I'm feeling like, we might be a little bit of a cartel with all the FT associations here, but since we're talking about competition. Let me, first of all, let me say thank you for having me here. Thanks to Ned. Thanks to be in the presence of these amazing academics who I usually call upon as sources. So I'm really honored to be sitting up here with you today. And I'm going to speak for just sort of 5 or 10 minutes and try and put some of the threads of what's been said already into a little bit of context with what I see in the news cycle. Oops, can everybody hear me? Okay, how's that? A little bit better? Hello? So I'm a journalist. I'm covering these issues on a day-to-day basis. And, you know, it's interesting. So much has happened in the last couple of years since 2016. And when I think about Donald Trump, I often think about the anti-hero in Herman Melville's The Confidence Man. I don't know if anyone's ever read that book, but he is kind of the ultimate con man. And the real characteristic of the con man, and this is one of the most powerful characteristics, is that you can sometimes embed a small nugget of truth in a welter of lies. And that's what actually becomes very powerful. And so I noticed before the election that the president said something that was actually quite truthful about the economy. He said that we were sitting on a big bubble in the market that was fueled by cheap debt, and it was going to burst and cause a massive recession. And that's actually true. Unfortunately, his own policies have helped to further inflate that bubble for reasons I'm going to talk a little bit about. But, you know, we have been, I think, not just through this administration, but through several administrations, in a very dysfunctional economic model. I wrote a whole book about it, looking at financialization. I think that the economy has basically been fueled by low interest rates, cheap debt, tax subsidies for the wrong kinds of investments for many, many years. And Charles knows a lot about this. He wrote a wonderful book about some of the problems in the banking sector that touch on some of this, and Glenn as well. But I see these problems, which this administration's policies have just pushed to the nth degree, as part of a larger 40-year cycle in which we've basically changed from an economy that was based more on growing Main Street to one that was based more on growing Wall Street. And just as a factual matter, I checked the percentage of financial assets relative to global GDP before coming in here because I wanted to see what the latest numbers were. Financial assets are 387% of global GDP. So that's an economy to me in which Wall Street is really the dog. It's not the tail, it's the entire dog of the economy now. And I think that that's really reflected in the fact that you have incredible bifurcation. We have stock markets, amazingly, that are still at near record highs, and yet you have very little wage inflation, you have growing inequality. And this presents an incredible conundrum for the Fed and for all the world's central bankers, because they've, of course, been left holding the bag for the last 10 years on keeping the economy afloat. And I really don't fault their efforts at all, but I think that we're really at the end of what one can do with monetary policy, and so we have to look at fiscal policy for some solutions. Unfortunately, this administration's policies have been, as Sandra said, and Ned, to give tax cuts to the wealthy, to continue to fuel a debt bubble, which has moved locations. If you look prior to 2008, debt was being held mainly by U.S. consumers, by U.S. banks. Consumers and banks are now in reasonably good shape. The debt has moved into the corporate sector, to China, to the emerging markets. We're already beginning to see hiccups there. I think that those are probably going to grow. And so you have this dysfunctional cycle that has just continued on and on. And thinking about how this connects to one of the areas that I think we're going to be discussing today, the big tech sector. We've already talked a little bit about companies like Apple, Amazon. The big tech platform companies are really where wealth lives right now. There are some interesting stats, McKinsey Global Institute stats, that show that about 80% of corporate wealth is now living in 10% of IP-rich firms. So these are, the brand names that you all know, some of the big biotech and pharma firms. But basically, companies that control data and intellectual property and ideas, that's where wealth is being held. And those companies are interacting with the financial markets in a way that builds on this dysfunctional cycle of financialization. So to link back to the president, one of the things we heard during the campaign is that the president wanted corporate tax cuts, wanted to quote unquote reform the U.S. tax system, lower the U.S. corporate tax rate so that companies like Apple, like Google, like Qualcomm, some of the big companies could bring back the over $2 trillion that is being held largely in offshore accounts. Well, I glanced at the cover of the Wall Street Journal before coming in here today, and of that over $2 trillion, only about $143 billion has actually come back to this country. Most of that has gone straight into share buybacks and dividend payments, which enrich basically the top 12% of the population that, again, owns 80% of the stock. You have not seen Main Street investment by those firms. So once again, it's a con. You know, these policies are a con, but they are building on previous decades of dysfunctional policy. So I think it took us a long time to get to where we are. I think it's going to take a long time, even if we have a new president, knock on wood, in 2 years, it's going to take us a long time to get to a better place. I will say one interesting thing, just to kind of link the issues of the president, economic growth, and competition and concentration of power. I've been putting a lot of my own efforts in reporting lately on looking at how technology platform companies have taken over a lot of the economy and what the competition effects of those have been. The president has been trying to make political hay with this topic. So you'll see a lot of tweets about Amazon, about Apple, about how terrible Jeff Bezos is. The policies of this administration actually say something incredibly different. In fact, the latest Trump agreement on NAFTA gives the same kind of loopholes to the big tech companies that they always had. So I just want to point out that once again, the president is talking one game in order to kind of make populist hay, but actually the policies are the same that they have always been. I think that we're going to see more action in this area, and I think it's going to be really bad for the economy because you are seeing through the coming trade war with China, tariffs, I think that you're going to see a further split, particularly around high-growth industries. In fact, I think we're probably moving to a kind of a splinter net where you're going to see the U.S., Europe, and China and some of the emerging markets going different directions on trade, but particularly high-growth industries. And you see a disturbing line in Washington right now around tech nationalism. So there are a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle saying, well, we can't regulate the largest tech firms. We can't really look carefully at breaking up these firms because we need them to be our national champions in this tech war against China. And that's dangerous for so many reasons. But I would just kind of draw all those things together and say that while I think Trump is the tip of an anti-competitive spear right now, I think he's just building on 40 decades of change. And there have been many threads that have been pulled there, and it's going to take a long time to get back. So with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Rana.
Professor Thank Hubbard. You. Good morning. I actually have some slides. I don't know if they're there. The world won't end if they are not. All right, well, let's assume.
There's a button thing up there.
Is there
This is me. Let me just first say three things by way of opening. First, thanks to Ned for doing this conference. I can think of no one's work more than Ned's that the administration needs to read. This is a time where true structural reform topics are front and center, not as much the business cycle. I'm less optimistic. They are being read, but they should be. The second, when I was originally asked to do this, competition wasn't the theme, but I promise I will use the word more than once in my remarks. But when I talk about growth and competition, I'm going to be talking about competition writ large. Part of this is competition that we think of generally in product markets. Rana alluded to that. But also I have in mind breaking down barriers to entry and mobility in a number of markets that I think are holding people back and are a definite problem. In the Trump presidency, there is a big deal at the beginning. I think if I had to give President Trump some credit, and I gather I was the person invited to try to do that, even though I'm not a Trump supporter. I think President Trump did, by his election and by some of his rhetoric, help reset expectations for growth. And that is not an easy thing to do. Unfortunately, simultaneous to that has been the introduction of a lot of noise that makes it very difficult for business people looking for those shifts in expectations to do something about it. And it's the and part that I wanted to talk a little bit about, generally what's been accomplished, and then get to competition. There are things that have been accomplished. I do think the administration has made progress in product market and financial market regulation. I would commend the Treasury's reports to people, and also the thoughtful work outside the government that people like Randy Quarles are doing at the Fed. I think the tax bill, I am a fan of the corporate part of the tax bill. I think the rest is much less good. But I am also a very big fan of the appointments the president has made when it counted in economic jobs. My colleague, our colleague here, Rich Clarida, Jay Powell, Randy Quarles, I think these are good things. And also what hasn't happened, when I first did this slide, I had said he didn't mess up trade. Well, that's overtaken by events, so I had to cross that off. Trade is very important in this context because it is an element of competition. Economists generally talk about the benefits of trade, rightly so, as consumer prices and consumer benefits, but as somebody who studies growth, I think of trade as being a discipline on firms and in a competitive dynamic. And it's in that sense, too, that tariffs are bad for the structural reasons to which Ned alluded in productivity. We haven't yet seen anti-business populism, fortunately, and as of yet, no new populist entitlements. So what's the long-term plan? I'm not altogether sure. There's certainly a rhetoric for resetting expectations. There's some long-term conversation about tax, but absolutely no policy process of which I'm aware. If this is a chess game, it's on a dimension that I guess I'm not smart enough to get. Now I want to skip the tax bill. I have a slide here. I actually like the corporate tax reform, but I want to get to competition. Part of being an economist in the White House is you try to do tutorials with the president. And so if I were talking to the president on competition, I'd use a slide like this with 3 shapes. And I would start with a triangle. And I start with a triangle because if you go back, I can tell by looking at all of you that Econ 101 was your absolute most favorite subject. You know that when you talk to students about monopoly, typically you're talking about triangles. So if you go back in professional work to Al Harburger's work on the welfare cost of monopoly, those numbers were relatively small. And what Harburger had in mind in measuring monopoly power was, in common parlance, things like cornering, schemes to raise price, things like that. The welfare cost of monopoly is fairly small. And there was a revolution, both in economics and the law, in antitrust, addressing what was seen to be not an overly large cost of monopoly. There is another shape besides the triangle, and it's a rectangle. Economists don't worry as much about triangles, but they do worry a lot about rectangles. And here I have in mind a number of potential things. One are platforms. So if instead of imagining cornering a commodity market or a market in industrial good, if I build a platform you all need, but set terms to deny you access, or at least give myself more favorable access than you, that is more serious. To those of you who are historians of antitrust, you can think back to Standard Oil's use of the railroads to facilitate monopoly. The issue is less about cornering the oil market than it was stopping competitors from using the railroads. So in the modern parlance, this is about adjacencies or monopoly leveraging and about the labor markets. I'd commend to everybody in this room some recent work. John Van Reenen, who's a professor at MIT, presented at the Fed Jackson Hole Conference on superstar firms. While I think these rectangles are important, I share the view of many economists that government intervention is still something I'd be a little bit skeptical of. These superstar firms are absolutely adding enormously to productivity growth, and I think it's very hard using at least traditional antitrust to go after them. So what's my question mark? Where would I end this conversation with the president? I'd say you need to think about a different kind of antitrust. You ought to be focused simply on entry of new firms and technologies. So I have in mind everything from promoting entry through access to platforms. I have in mind a force with public-private partnerships on management practices. making sure that corporate governance is facilitating entry, trying to avoid dual labor markets that are rapidly emerging, where superstar firms attract the most talented workers, and so on. To me, if I were to look for a Republican analogy, I'm not thinking Trump, I'm actually thinking of Lincoln. So I think of the Lincoln era's economic policies as being a battering ram for entry. Emancipation is the most obvious, but I'm thinking the Transcontinental Railroad, I'm thinking land-grant colleges, and so on. So I think all of this is a robust set of policies. What could be done, to build on something Rana said, is to get more people in the boat before you speed it up. Traditional conservative rhetoric is about raising growth, obviously a good thing to do. Part of the political economy of the moment, though, is many people are suspicious of policies that might do that because of the view, again, not crazily shared, that they might not participate in that. So to my mind, a growth-oriented policy also has this new framework for antitrust and support for work. Again, a theme Ned has worked on in his own work for years. In the US parlance, that would be programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit, but there are a number of wage subsidies and mobility incentives that I think could be important. Also on the competition front, there's an opportunity for the US to reassert its leadership. We were leaders on the international stage, not for eleemosynary reasons, which is the way I think the president characterizes it. We were leaders for our own good, and thankfully we were, and we should be again. I would also agree, there are pictures there of Erskine Bowles and Senator Alan Simpson, that we really have to get back to a notion of fiscal sustainability, not just because it's good in its own sake, although it clearly is, but because it generates the fiscal space that we're going to need to deal with some of the interventions that I suggested. A Trumpian fiscal reform could include a lot of things. My own adjustment, something I had recommended, didn't happen in tax reform, which is border adjustments, but I would be a fan of a value-added tax or a carbon tax in this regard as well. I think there are enormous work to be done in the so-called entitlement programs. And I say this not so much about the math of budgets, although that's very important, but very much to generate the kind of fiscal space that would let the country be able to support work and get more people in the boat. So how could a Trumpian economic process score some points? I think if the administration perhaps moved away from a contempt for expertise toward trying to grab some of it. I already said Ned's books should be top of that reading list. And I think that the focus that could be had is really on what I put there in blue, on competition, on inclusive growth, and on work. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Hubbard.
While they're getting my slides up, let me also thank Ned for including me in this conference, and especially in this panel. Let's see, do we have some? Good. And so the first thing I want to do is associate myself very strongly.
It's wage setting time. This is the.
I want to say that I think that what Dean Hubbard said, every single word is correct. In fact, I think we should all, if you weren't taking notes, I do have a transcript and I've already got copies in the back. No. I also will be commenting a little bit on Rana's presentation, but I do sincerely agree with what both of them have to say. So rather than contradicting them or trying to show why they were missing some things, I just want to dig a little deeper into some of these themes. And so my discussion will divide into three parts, two that I prepared and one that I didn't, but in response to something you said. And the two that I prepared are talking about, do we have a competition problem in the US? What's the evidence that we might? And secondly, what are the current macroeconomic trends and how do we think about the impact of the administration on those? And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about this bubble issue and especially about emerging markets. And I think I have, how many minutes do I have for all that?
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, I can do that. So the first thing, this is an abstract from a paper that I recommend that all of you take a look at. It just was published in June. It's called, Are U.S. Industries Becoming More Concentrated? And the answer is yes. And as you can see from the highlighted versions of the abstract here, this article suggests that market power has become an important part of the value creation of firms, and that there's been a major structural shift that has weakened competition. What I want to emphasize about this is we've all been watching it happen for the last 20 years. And in fact, the major acceleration of this happened in the last couple of years of the Clinton administration and during the Bush administration, and was completely tolerated during the Obama administration. So let me just show you a few slides. This study I recommend because it has regressions and analysis of profitability, but I just want to show you the more simple sort of visual picture of this. Number of firms in the US by industry has been shrinking. The average size, I could measure this any way you'd like, but in terms of assets, publicly traded firms, this is also true of private firms, but this graph's about public firms. Whether you do it by asset sales or market equity, it's been growing dramatically. Notice that the inflection point here is the late 1990s. Furthermore, this is something that's true at every decile of the distribution, of the size distribution. It's not just the very top. You might have thought it's only at the superstar firms, but it's not. It's happening throughout the distribution. Again, with the big change happening around the early 1990s and inflection later. And that's the upper deciles, the same story. So the point is, we have an interesting phenomenon here. Okay, so first of all, there's some indication there's a problem, so what should we do about it? I think Glenn's comments are very well taken, that the world has changed since the 1990s, and in fact, if you go back and read what some of the Clinton administration officials were saying about this at the time, they were even saying, be careful not to react to this, thinking about it in terms of the old monopoly model. In a world where these large concentrations of firms are driven by advantages from globalization and new technologies, maybe the best thing to do is to promote new generations of competitors for them. And in fact, the bigger the rents are for the current generation, the more you'll get incentives for the future. So we have to think dynamically, intergenerationally about competition, not just thinking currently. However, since I haven't done any research of my own on this, that's the final intelligent comment I have to make. So I now will leave it. No, I don't really have anything else interesting to say about it. So I'm hoping we'll have an interesting discussion of this. I thought Glenn's comments about entry were very well taken, though, and fit very much the theme. Although the same people who we've all been saying this about, I do have a little bit of a doubt of whether Google is going to be displaced as easily as firms were displaced 10 years ago, or whether Amazon's going to be displaced. So I'm not so sure that we can assume that the same process is going to keep happening. I also thought that the discussion of tech nationalism in your presentation fit very nicely with this platform sort of economies of scale that Glenn's talking about, and that really is a challenge. So I don't have a lot to say about it. Now, what about the economy's performance since 2016? And here what I want to tell you, and I know that there probably aren't a lot of fans of the administration in the audience today, but I want to say, let's all take a deep breath and get real. There's been significant economic progress in the last almost 2 years, and you can't reasonably argue that it's unrelated to some of the policies in the Trump administration. So I want to show you what I think the evidence is for that. And what I want to emphasize is not just the positive trends, but what I'm going to call positive news. In other words, economic actors' expectations about what they were experiencing have changed. Everyone's been updating positively their expectations about economic growth. Market participants, the stock market's up 39% since the election. I find that pretty impressive. But it's not just that. Median income in 2017 rose 1.8%. The administration argues that if you adjust for demographic changes and labor participation, wages have been going up about 1.4%, which I think fits the median income increase. Furthermore, business expectations have changed dramatically, as I'll show you. Businesses immediately became much more optimistic and have remained optimistic when Trump was elected. And finally, if you look at the CBO's own forecasts of the economy, they've continuously updated their forecasts and shifted them up. So there's just simply no way to argue that we're just having a playing out of things that were already baked in the cake. There's been a dramatic positive change. In fact, if you were teaching a class on the Keynesian idea of animal spirits having a positive side, this would simply be the 2 years that you would want to point to. There probably hasn't been a time I can think of when there's been such an immediate increase in positive animal spirits in the last 2 years. So if you've missed all that, or if you find it an inconvenient truth, no matter what you think of the president's policies, I think let's all be at least realistic. And so what I wanted to do is show you what the current administration, in the press conference that Kevin Hassett presented a week ago, what slides they used to make these points. So I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. So this is, if you haven't seen this, it's available online. You can find it very easily from a week ago. So let's look at business expectations. So I won't talk about each of these, but they all tell the same story. So small business optimism went from a score of about 95 to a score of 105 immediately at the election. The percentage of businesses that believed it was a good time to expand went from 10% to 25% and stayed there. That happened immediately. So I think it's a little hard to argue that that wasn't the consequence of the election. What about fixed investment? And of course, a big part of the sell for the tax policy change to cut the corporate tax rate. And by the way, the Obama administration sometimes supported that policy too. A big part of the sell was it was going to change equipment investment that was going to increase productivity, which it has a little bit, still early days, that would increase real wages, which it, I think, has a little bit, although it's still early days. But there's just no question that equipment investment has completely reversed. And by any kind of calculation, we could quibble, put some nonlinearity into these trends, pick different starting years. You're simply not going to get a story that equipment investment hasn't been an amazing turnaround story. And that's true for capital goods orders and shipments. I could keep going. What about labor force participation? I'm sorry, this is new business formation. Well, clearly new business formation has also been taking off. You can see that it's departing from its trend, and it's an important cumulative change. If you looked at new labor force entry into the labor force, it also has been increasing. And I won't talk about each of these. This, I think, maybe is the most interesting slide. It shows that the CBO's forecasts for the economy have shifted substantially over time. So assuming the CBO is a nonpartisan forecaster of the economy, there's just no question that a reasonable forward-looking macroeconomist has substantially changed their view of economic growth over the last 2 years. Now I want to turn, I probably have a couple minutes still. So I just want to turn to this other topic that Rana just alluded to, and I won't be able to say much about it today. It's a topic I'm doing a lot of research on right now. It's the question of, has there been a kind of volatility and bubble in the international economy that is especially going to play out, unfortunately, in a negative way for emerging markets? And I think the answer is yes. I think that monetary policy globally, some of my new research is showing, was very much a source of the capital flows to emerging markets that really propelled both debt flows and equity flows in a direction we've not seen in a very long time, if ever, and that we've already seen, those have been cut in half already, both in the bond and the equity flows, with, I think, fairly dramatic consequences. And by the way, I want to emphasize something else. If you think that the way that monetary policy in the U.S. has been positive for the U.S. economy over the last decade has been primarily through its effect on interest rates, I think you're wrong. That actually, I think that interest rates have been awash. That is, the mortgage market was goosed up, but bank lending for other purposes was actually hurt, bank loan supply. What was the real positive? And when I've talked to people at the Fed, they've admitted that in their own model, this is the conclusion too. It was the depreciation of the exchange rate, which was a temporary effect until it was largely undone by the competitive depreciation policies of the Japanese and the Europeans. And so we had a lot of exchange rate volatility, and now we're having an exchange rate comeuppance for emerging markets and equity markets in emerging markets. I think that QE was actually a departure from the historical norms against competitive devaluations by developed countries. I think that it was not the right policy, and I think that it has created huge volatility for emerging markets, and we're about to experience. Turkey and Argentina are just the beginning of what I'm very worried about. So I think this point of yours, we're about to be dealing with it in a very serious way. Thanks for your attention.
Can we all come back here? Or?
Yes, of course. I'll open
Rana,
up
you
the
should-
panel.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to jump in and comment on a couple of things Charles said, which I think are incredibly interesting. To connect the issues of Google and also emerging market debt, which I look a lot at China, and just as a quick, back of the envelope stat, it took about $1 of debt to create $1 of growth in China prior to 2008. It creates, you need now about $6 of debt to create $1 of growth in China. So that's a pretty massive bubble. But the question is how it will deflate, what the ripples will be, and that's dependent on the political economy in China, right? And the structure of how things work there. And there's plenty of reserves, although as we saw a couple of years ago in August, they can be run down pretty quickly as well. But this question of the political economy, I think, is really, really interesting and connects a lot of what we're talking about. Because to go back to your point, Charles, about Google, and you said, I think rightly, that you don't expect them to be pushed back or broken up anytime soon. I think that is largely because of the growth of money politics in Washington, which has just really taken off, in recent years. There was actually some interesting work that Thomas Philippon at NYU did recently, looking at concentration and competition in the U.S. versus Europe, and he came to the conclusion that a lot of the difference has to do with the fact that you can just pour so much more money into politics in America. So I think that's a really, really interesting area to be thinking about. The other thing that I wanted to comment on is something that Glenn said, which is that it's true these platform firms do contribute a lot to productivity, but I'm really interested in the data there, because what we can see, and I think we all know that there are some measurement issues that a lot of people are working on, but what you can see is a bifurcation in that productivity, and it happens at a country level, at a sector level, at a firm level. The top few firms, most productive, that are able to disseminate technology the best in a couple of sectors are doing really well, and many others, and unfortunately those tend to be the labor heavy sectors, education, healthcare, are doing less well. So that would be, I think, also an interesting area for policy and how to disseminate best practice. The third thing I'm really thinking about, and I'm curious whether you all or anyone really in the audience has thoughts on this, is how data as the new currency changes things. Does this really change the economic laws of gravity when data rather than dollars is the currency? And I think it does. I think for starters, free isn't free. We pay for a lot of what we're getting from this new generation of companies with our own personal data. That's totally transparent. That has big implications for antitrust, and the FTC is really starting to look pretty closely at all of this. So I think that's something to think about. How much transparency is there in terms of how these firms work, what their business model is, and how wealth sharing is happening?
I just had a few things. First, to agree with the point Charlie made about QE. I've always felt that the part of quantitative easing that made sense was at the very beginning what I would almost call a market microstructure problem between the mortgage market and the treasury market. After that, I think it was largely about foreign exchange. The second is a point about techno-nationalism. China has embraced a 2025 strategy, Made in China 2025. It is clearly a techno-nationalist strategy. The right response from the United States should not be a counterpoint techno-nationalist strategy or the identification of national champions, but it really should be a strong entry and basic research strategy. There are a lot of public good elements in basic research. The government does have a role to play there, while it doesn't have a role in picking winners. And I think that's a discussion that's lost in the administration on China. On the issue of big firms and productivity, I mentioned earlier John Van Reenen's work. And again, going back to the earliest part of what John and Nick Bloom did, it's now about a decade old, there is, as Rana said, just an enormous fanning out within and across countries of productivity and profitability in firms. Part of that is a story about organizations. Maybe it's because I'm sitting presently in a business school, I'll mention this theme, This is a big deal, and understanding management practices is something that public-private partnerships, I think, can help with, as I said. Final point I would make, something Rana said I think is very important, is about price. When I was talking about the difference between triangles and rectangles and the way I think about monopoly old and monopoly new, be careful not to just focus on price. Traditional views of monopoly are, is the consumer better off? And of course, if something's free, it's kind of hard to argue a consumer somehow being harmed, except if, as you say, that free is associated with foreclosure of future competition.
Okay.
Can I just make one comment too? I totally agree with your point about the techno-nationalism debate, and what we're missing, I think, in this country is that decentralization as opposed to centralization is probably the best way to compete if you're talking about a US-China race. That's all.
Perhaps one question for Professor Hubbard. You mentioned that we made progress in the area of regulation. I presume you mean deregulation, and I have a question in that context for Rana, because I think part of the problem with regard to the superstar economy is globalization, technological progress, which has been driven by the financial industry and the closeness, like you mentioned, of the money and finance, essentially. What would you say, how is the financialization distorting competition, and how would you see that in the context of deregulation?
Before you answer just the premise of your question, my point was about smarter regulation and using cost-benefit analysis. I'm director of MetLife. We sued the state on exactly this point and won in court. That's what I mean.
Thank you for your clarification.
Okay, so the question is, how should we think about deregulation to address financialization? Well, I think that there's not a silver bullet. It's interesting, when I was writing my own book, Makers and Takers, about financialization, anyone who's written a book will, I'm sure, be familiar with this. My publisher said, well, we need a solutions chapter at the end, and there need to be, three, you guys have been through this, right? And there need to be 3 solutions. And I said, we're talking about 40 years of change across multiple areas of many economies. There's not 3 solutions. So, but I think I'm actually going to pivot a little bit and say, smart regulation is great. I don't think we're going to get that in this administration, and I think it's difficult enough even when you have a more sensible administration. I think looking at the tax code is a very interesting place that we could actually find some low-hanging fruit. I wrote about this in my book. I think that our tax code subsidizes all kinds of incredibly unproductive debt. I look around my neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I think house prices would be about half of what they are if I wasn't allowed to write off so much debt on my mortgage. It benefits me, not such a great thing for the market overall. Corporate debt, same thing. You look at the way in which a company like Apple, for example, not to pick on them, but they're big, so it's easy to make the case, holding about 10% of all of America's liquid corporate wealth, a lot of it in offshore tax havens. They don't need any money for operating costs, haven't needed since the 90s, and yet have more involvement in the capital markets than ever before. That, to me, is kind of Kafkaesque, and I think it's certainly not what Adam Smith thought the financial system should be doing. And so looking at the ways in which the tax code subsidizes those sorts of unproductive behaviors, I think could be a place for maybe some bipartisan change.
Okay. We could open up the floor to a couple of questions. We have very little time, so if you have a question, I would just ask you to keep it really short. Yes, please. Thank you. Any other question? I have a question actually for Professor Calomiris. I think the underpinning of any functioning economy are functioning institutions, and we've seen President Trump attacking institutions and acting increasingly more unilaterally, arbitrarily, and without regarding process. How can we counteract that?
Oh, what an interesting question. So Actually, I run an initiative at Stanford, the Hoover Institution, called the Initiative on Regulation and the Rule of Law. And that took up that after Alan Meltzer started it, with Alan actually started it. And we've been studying the departure from process and regulation fairly closely for the past 4 years. It's really predates the Trump administration. I think you're right that the Trump administration is not inclined, as Ned pointed out in his comments, not inclined toward reversing it. However, it's really been a problem since the 1970s. One indicator of this is the ratio of guidance to formal rulemaking in regulation, which really took off in the 1970s, but accelerated dramatically in the recent administration. So what guidance is this, I think someone just referred to Franz Kafka. Well, certainly that is what guidance is. It's like you're stuck in the trial and you're never going to get out, because the regulator will say, well, I don't know what I don't want you to do yet, but when you do it, I'll let you know. And that's much more convenient for regulators, but it's not very good for business and it's not good for our democracy. I think it's a big problem. And I agree with you that there's no indication that the administration's dealing with it. But like a lot of these problems, competition and other things, these are things that really go back, in this case, 4 decades, and it's been getting worse and worse. Do we really want to live in a liberal democracy? I do. And I think that I'm not sure everybody does. I was talking to one foreign official who shall remain nameless over the telephone, and he said, you know, you in the US, you use the term deep state, but that's a very ugly term. I mean, really, we experts know better. And so the idea of unlimited power for discretion of people in administrative positions in government is not something that necessarily is so unpopular. That's very worrying to me. So I don't think it's just Trump. I think it's very deeply ingrained. We need to take back our democracy. It means rules that constrain discretion.
Rules and the respect of norms, one could argue.
Absolutely right.
We can take one question if you keep it really short.
Yes, the subject of this conference is economic consequences of Trump presidency. And I would like the panel to provide the context a bit as comparing with economic consequences of a presidency of President Bush, W. Bush. Why? Because his 2 years started economically in a similar vein. Huge tax cut, much bigger than now, deregulation. So how would you compare economic consequences of 2 years President Trump and 2 years President Bush?
Professor Hubbard.
Well, you can blame me for that one. I think it's very hard to compare presidencies. You compare economies. And so you have to ask yourself, what are the structures and the shocks of the time? So the way I would grade presidencies is on how did you respond to an environment? Did you make it better or worse? So to me, when I think of the Trump presidency, what I'm most worried about, as I think I said in my remarks, is a missed opportunity. I think there are huge opportunities for structural change, frankly, that would benefit Trump's own political base, and he's not doing it. That's the big issue. For President Bush, I think there was probably not enough of a realization of the need for very long-term fiscal reform. Remember when President Bush started, it's hard, this sounds like ancient history, but the budget was in massive surpluses as far as the eye could see. What would you do with the surplus, how to manage that, and so on. So I think a lot just depends on the time and the place. But for this administration, I at least try to spend more of my time less on just beating up President Trump, but more on just suggesting there's a huge missed opportunity if he'd only grab it. And it's actually in his political interest to do so if he'd only see it.
This is a great note to end on. Thank you very much. But before we formally wrap up, Professor Phelps wanted to say a couple of words.
One tiny thing on a personal note. Over the weekend, the news was that Glenn Hubbard is stepping down as Dean of Columbia's Business School after I don't know how many years, but it's in decades. Glenn has been a fabulous colleague and a great friend of the center. And I thought we should congratulate him on his endurance and thank him for his contribution.